In our final lesson, we're going to talk about parts of the new millennium, and we'll be on page 8 of your interactive notebook. The year 2000 kicked off with a presidential election. We saw the Republican candidate George W. Bush, the son of former President George H.W. Bush, face off against Democrat Al Gore, who was the incumbent vice president. This was the most bitterly contested election in almost 100 years. Over about half of American eligible voters went out to the polls that day, and it became a virtual tie. The state of Florida was the one that was in most question. There were 25 electoral votes up for grabs, and as you can see by the picture in the bottom right-hand corner, the popular vote in Florida showed a virtual tie. There were various voting issues and problems. So there was an ordered recount. As you can see by the gentleman in the bottom right-hand corner, they had to literally count each vote by hand. They used a punch machine system, and unfortunately some of the ballots were not punched all the way through, double punched. There was lots and lots of problems. So they had to go through and count and count and count. Al Gore's campaign is who ordered the recount, and they recounted several counties several times. Eventually, the Supreme Court stepped in and voted 5-4 to stop the recounts. Al Gore had won the popular vote. However, George Bush goes on to win the Electoral College, 271 to 266 votes. Remember, you need 270 votes to become president. While in office, advisors, staff members, and even the Vice President, Dick Cheney, were granted more responsibility for setting policy. Some of the domestic issues that Bush focused on included a $1.3 trillion tax cut. He had worked with Congress to receive approval for that, and it resulted in a $300 rebate for most taxpayers. In the realm of education, he worked to create the No Child Left Behind Act, and this was an education reform bill that called for redirecting funding for schools and increased accountability. He also worked with a program known as Medicare to provide prescription drug coverage for seniors, and he allocated billions of dollars into the fight for HIV and AIDS. Shortly into his presidency, tragedy struck on September 11th, 2001. Here on this day, terrorists struck targets in New York City and Washington, D.C. This is the moment that George Bush was notified about the attacks. He was actually in Florida visiting elementary schools at the time. So now let's go ahead and watch a short video about those attacks on that day. So, in response to the terrorist attacks, Americans responded to the tragedy with an outpouring of support for the victims and the heroes of that day. President Bush vowed to bring justice to those who were responsible for the attack. It was identified that those who were behind it were Al-Qaeda, and the mastermind was a man by the name of Osama bin Laden. About a month later, on October 7th, the United States started the campaign known as Operation Enduring Freedom, which was a bombing campaign against the nation of Afghanistan, who we believed was harboring the terrorists. The Bush administration also created a new cabinet-level department that we know so well these days, the Department of Homeland Security. As I said, Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden were behind the 9/11 attacks, and the Bush administration also tied them to Iraq and Saddam Hussein. You'll remember Saddam Hussein from the Persian Gulf War with George Bush's father. By January of 2002, at the State of the Union address, President Bush sent a warning to hostile nations to stop developing weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. He declared that Iraq, Iran, and North Korea were an axis of evil. By November of 2002, Saddam Hussein allowed the United Nations weapons inspectors to resume search for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The United States had claimed that they were creating nuclear weapons. They reported finding no weapons, but President Bush still petitioned Congress to declare war on Iraq in March of 2003. Some other major events that occurred in the 2000s included the Space Shuttle Columbia. Unfortunately, on its re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, it disintegrated, killing all members of the flight crew. Saddam Hussein was eventually captured in 2003. He was put on trial and executed in 2006 for crimes against humanity. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina, a massive storm, devastated parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. And the Bush administration, as well as FEMA, were criticized for their slow response. Moving towards the end of the 2000s, we saw the election of the first African-American president, Barack Obama. One of his major focus while in office was healthcare reform. He wanted to help people be able to afford health insurance and provide quality health care for all Americans. In 2010, he signed the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which goes on to become known as Obamacare. Focusing on the economy, he had inherited what became known as the Great Recession, brought on by the financial crisis of 2008. Unemployment got as high as 10%. However, during his administration, he was able to create over 11 million jobs. He pushed for higher taxes, larger federal government, and stimulus plans to eventually get the economy moving again. One of the last things he was able to do as president is seen in this photograph. They were able to capture and kill Osama bin Laden in 2011. This is where we'll end our course. There's a lot of history still being made. As cheesy as it sounds, you're living history every single day. And remember, it comes down to different perspectives, analyzing your sources, your evidence, looking at where people come from, and knowing that history is what makes us all who we are. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this class, and please keep studying history.